Yes, Uncle Dave, we can hear you.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. All right, Vaughan, it's over to you.
All right, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me all right?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So literally, I thought we could just do a quick 1-minute recap. When we do the handout, the slides will all be there again, but I think it's good to hear this thing multiple times, bearing in mind that our goal here is not just for each of us personally, but if we are parents, that we could take our children through this before they get their first paycheck. But also, if you bump into people who need help with this kind of discussion, at least you've got this thing well and truly sorted in your head. So we'll do a quick recap. Then we're going to dive into budgeting. Remember, everything flows from that margin I'm going to talk about in a second. And getting your budget right for that is going to be the big criteria, because if we get that right, everything flows so nicely from there. So we're going to speak about what is a budget. If I've never done one before, how do I do it? So we're going right back to building blocks. Then we'll go into some examples just to illustrate, because for some people, when you see an example, it all fits into place. And then we'll have a bit of a discussion around what Dave was just talking about. How do I build margin? In other words, reducing the expenses or increasing the income. We'll speak a bit about debt. We're going to talk more about debt next week as well. And then a little bit about medium-term planning. How do you have your budget with kind of a 5-year window as well? So that's the journey we're going to go through. I've just included these slides for when you get the handouts. They'll be there again. Remember, last week we spoke about the bad news, the good news, and the 4 steps. And we're going to be zooming into step number 1 in terms of doing our budgets today or this evening. So remember the 2 families where we said that when you add up their obligation, needs, and wants, that basically their money has run out before the end of the month. And depending upon how serious your situation is, in other words, whether that salary line intersects at your needs, then you've got a much bigger restructure we need to do, or your wants. We're going to show an example in Excel where it intersects with your wants, and we'll illustrate how do you then restructure, because step 1 is that margin block on the right-hand side here. We need to get where regularly every month we've got a little bit of money as margin. And the whole budgeting process is crucial to getting a grip on our costs so that we can end up with that margin on a regular basis. So everything flows from margin. Once we've got some margin, remember what we can do then is use that margin to pay off our debt, which we're going to be speaking about this whole cycle in week 3. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but you need that margin to start killing your debt. Once we've been killing our debt, that then allows us to start using that money to invest. Once we start investing that money, we start getting a return. And therefore, we don't just earn a salary anymore. So this is the diversification concept, that we then have got income coming in as well. Until that continues to grow, until we get to the point where our salary and income, our income from non-salary means is more than our expenses. And at that point, you are actually financially free, because it means that you then actually have the choice in terms of what you want to do, and you can still live off the other income. So those were the 4-step journey that we're going to now zoom into the first step of that. I just wanted to mention, I've included a slide here that says exactly those concepts. If you just translate them into a farming concept, they are still there. You obviously don't have salary, but you've got farm income, and your growth then would be from other income, non-agri income. So you've got a source of income that's diversified from the agricultural sector. Okay, so now we're going to zoom into budgeting. And remember, we spoke about that all our expenses are grouped into these 3 categories: obligations. And just to go into a little bit more detail around the 4 kind of buckets we could think of them as. obviously there's all those obligations that we contractually need to pay that are debt related. So, and those payments have always got interest and capital in them, and we'll talk about this next week in more detail. Then there are those contractual obligations that are relating to risk. So this is medical, life, disability, insurance, etc. It's still contractual. We're obliged to pay it. Then we've got statutory obligations, rates, taxes. So those are all the ones we need to pay by law. And then you get the odds and sods that we've signed for, usually things like rent, municipality, school fees, etc. So those are all our obligations. Remember, needs, that's everything we need to live and work. And wants are the things we don't have to have, but they are nice to have. And remember, as a Christian, you know, some people would argue, you know, does wants have a place for a believer? And the answer for me, my personal opinion, is absolutely. God doesn't want us to live this life that's miserable. He enjoys that we've got things that are luxury for us and nice. I'm not saying we go overboard, but in our plan, there's nothing wrong with planning to have some good things. All right, so with that in mind, what then is a budget? So very simply, budget is just if we list all our planned and actual money that comes in, i.e. income, and money that goes out, in other words, expenses. So imagine that we did a little table like this, and we're going to go to the Excel example in a moment. So imagine we had, I'm going to use an example of a couple. So we've got spouse one, spouse two, who both bring take-home pay. Maybe you earn a little bit of interest or some investments. So that's our total income. And then our expenses, imagine we've now grouped everything into obligation, needs, and wants. So we've made a list of them, and on average, we've got what are planned, and then we track what is our actual expenditure month by month. And when we compare those two, we can see how's our plan versus our actual going. So in very simple pictorial terms, that's a budget. And you may ask the question, why should we do this? Obviously, remember, our goal here is to make sure on a regular basis we've got that margin that we were looking at in that previous block. And so the reason why we do a budget is we need to get a handle on our finances. We have to know where our money's going. Otherwise, you're never going to build that margin on a regular and a sustainable basis. But more than that, the plan, and that's what we're going to be talking about a bit later on in today's session, the plan to get you to financial freedom is so important, because in that plan column, over time, we have a journey that we're going to walk till eventually we are financially free. So this budgeting thing is actually the first fundamental building block. If we can't get this thing right, it does make it much harder to really walk that journey of financial freedom. So I know sometimes when you hear this word budget, our minds shut down. But please, I'm hoping that, you know, there's so many great apps and tools nowadays that make this quite easy. And we're going to just show a very simple Excel example today. So let's dive into a little bit more detail. If I have never done a budget before, where do I start? So the first thing we got to do is we've got to get a handle on where's our money going at the moment. So this is all about our current picture. So normally what we suggest is we say start tracking all your expenses according to those categories we were speaking about. I'm going to show a table in the next slide, and track it for a couple of months. I would have said minimum 2 to 3 months. Sometimes 6 months might be enough. It depends upon how much things change month to month. Obviously, you know, you've got periods like Easter and December where your cost structure does change a bit. So try and make sure you've got a representative picture of what a typical month looks like that goes, you know, the average monthly spread across the whole year. So that's the first picture, is we start tracking. Now that we are tracking, we're going to show you in the spreadsheet, that's your actual column where we say, right, that's what we are actually spending at the moment. Now we're starting to move towards the planning column, where we need to now say, okay, how are we going to get that on a regular basis? We've got money left over every single month. And that's where you make a plan, and you've got to start deciding where can we cut, or where can we get more income from. And we're going to go through some ideas in a moment around what are some of the areas we could look at that inform this plan. But a lot of them is actually quite self-explanatory. It's really about the discipline of doing that. So the points 3 and 4 relate to our plan and how are we going to build that margin. I think what's really important if you're married, that as a couple, you're on the same page when it comes to this thing. Because if one of you is trying to do it alone, it just is so much harder. So that's quite an important thing. Obviously, if you're single, it's much easier. It's up between you and God to sort out your plan. And really, you need to have a sense that God's blessing is upon this, because you're going to need his encouragement and discipline to stick with the program. Points 5 and 6 really just say, once we are now going, so we have our actuals, we have our plan, and on a regular basis now we've got some margin. So what's important to remember now is this concept of closing the circle. I did mention it last week. What that means is, as I'm starting to get margin, if you remember that little white block on the top of that stack bar graph, as I'm starting to get margin, don't fall for the temptation that you increase your cost of living, because it's too easy now. Oh, I've regularly got $1,000 every month, and so the needs and the wants start growing. And eventually then you lose your margin. Closing the circle means even as I've got spare cash, I stick to my budget. Then the whole issue of intentionality is so important, because you can have this plan, but if you don't actually action it, it's not going to achieve anything. You've probably wasted time. So intentionality, discipline, those kind of words are massively important. What's also important is that you keep this budget. It's a living document. You've got to think of it as, because your life situation changes. So I know you guys don't talk about dinkies anymore, but in my early years, I was called a dinky. It stands for double income, no kids yet. So this is when you have a married couple, they don't have kids. That's when you've got the most money you'll probably ever have, because you've got nothing to spend your double incomes on. And that budget would look a certain way. Maybe you're still renting, you haven't bought yet, etc. So your budget looks different. Then you start getting kids, your budget definitely looks different. You've got to start planning for education. That looks different. Eventually, later on in life, you've got weddings. Later on, you've got retirement. So the whole time, every year or so, you've got to just look at your budget and say, how do I tweak the plan? While still keeping on my journey towards financial freedom. I was mentioning to you, technology makes it a lot easier. I can find out both my daughters use, I think they actually use 2 different smartphone apps. And, the tracking of your actual expenses is so easy now. Every time they swipe the card or touch the phone, you just book the transaction against an expense category, and boom, it's done. It's tracked for you. So not as with smartphones or Excel, it's actually so easy. I made a little joke there with the envelopes question mark. In the old days, what the guys used to do is they used to get their cash, and then they'd have envelopes in the kitchen. And this envelope was for groceries. This envelope was to pay the electricity, this envelope. So each of those categories had a little envelope, and that was how they managed it in the old days. Nowadays, you don't have to do that. We've got much simpler ways to use technology to track your expenses, and you put in your plan, and it will monitor for you how you're doing versus your plan. So use those to make life easier, because you don't want this to be a big admin burden. So let's talk a little bit about, so those are the kind of 8 steps that keep you going in the medium and long term on a budget. Let's talk a little bit about those categories. That point number 1 says track them according to your categories. So like Dave said, every person is different and unique, but just to illustrate, so you'll see I've made a table of obligation, needs, and wants, and sometimes you can see there's merged cells. I'm just trying to illustrate there, depending upon your situation and the way you're thinking and interpret this, it could be a need or a want or an obligation and a need. I wouldn't get too hung up what bucket you put it in. Just find an easy, kind of an easy convention that works for you, and then stick with it. At the end of the day, what's important is what items you are tracking. So those are just some ideas around, what could some of the maintenance items be? Sorry, maintenance. What some of the budget items be? And we're going to show some of these examples in the Excel example in a moment. I think just a couple of thoughts in terms of what level of detail do you go to? So I think that initially don't make more than about 20 line items. So don't go and have a list of 100 expense items. It's just going to be impossible for you to maintain it. Rather just try and identify at least the kind of 10 to 15 expense categories in, not in each of these buckets, across the total. Somewhere around 15, 20 is usually manageable enough, but also detailed enough that you know where your money's going. So don't go to too much detail and then you can't maintain it, obviously. But on the other hand, don't only make it 5 items that you track, because then, for example, you could just make one item called you could make one item called groceries and clothes, and you wouldn't know, where's all our money going, because you've got this huge bucket that too much is going into. Okay. Dave very kindly said if we had to translate this concept for a farming situation, what could that look like? Just to illustrate, it's the same thoughts, but obviously different concepts. Dave, I don't know if there's anything you want to just talk through here.
No, I think the farmers, they can just have a look at that and see what, it was actually quite difficult. So to know where to put things in, because I think every farm is very different as well. And but I think farmers can have a look at that. So thing like salary, or a thing like salaries of casuals is a nice thing to have. It's nice to have lots of extra oaks, but when you look again, and so the cost. And I also put feeds and licks there, because it's also one of those kind of things. It's nice to feed your animals, and they look nice, but when you see, so what it does there to your bottom line anyway. So, but the farmers can have a look at that thing.
All right. So bearing in mind now we have a rough idea on what our expense categories are going to be. We've got them grouped in terms of, is it obligation, needs, or wants? So now's the time when we can start putting this into either an app, or the example I'm going to use is Excel. So I'm going to use the example of a couple, but if you transport this, whether you're single or whether it's a business, the concepts, the principles are much the same. So remember, this is now an example where currently our take-home pay, which is the green line, for the combined couple is intersects with the wants. So this is an example where, with some clever changes, we can end up with our plan where we have a margin at the end of each month. Obviously, if that green line intersects into your needs, it's going to require a little bit more radical restructuring. But I think let's just use this as an example. I think it will illustrate what we're talking about there. Okay, so I'm hoping a little spreadsheet has popped through on your screens. Is that correct? Dave?
Yeah, correct.
Okay. So right up top here is our income. I'm using an example here where we've got a couple, married couple, each are earning 16,000. The company takes off tax. I've assumed 10% tax, more or less what you would be earning if you earn 16,000. I've made the assumption that you're quite fortunate. You work for a company that pays half of your medical aid. So I've assumed this is a little family and you've got a 6,000 Rand a month medical aid. It's probably more like a basic hospital plan kind of option at that price. And I've assumed that you are contributing 7.5% towards retirement, and the company's matching it with another 7.5%. So, I mean, I know this may not be, every company's situation, but I'm just trying to illustrate your traditional advice is you should really be aiming to put away 15% in terms of retirement, but I'm making an assumption here that the company helps. It's part of the package deal they offer us. And I've assumed they've got 500 Rand a month they earn from interest, let's say. So their take-home pay is just under 24,000 Rand a month. You'll see that green line on the graph over there, 24,000. When they've now spent their 3 months or 4 months tracking their actual expenses, what they find is the following. So I've used an example here where currently they are contributing 1,900 towards tithes. They've got a rental of 5,000 a month, car repayment. They've got short-term store debt of 1,000 Rand a month. They pay 750 for municipal, water and lights, and they've got a life policy for 1,000 Rand a month. And then, so this is just a little scenario I made up. I mean, it may look different for you. They've got food, they've got clothes, etc. So we've put all their expenses down, and you can see on the graph is probably easier. Okay, so Houston, we don't have margin yet. We now need to restructure our plan so that we come in below that green line with our plan. So remember, step one was track your expenses. We've tracked them. We've decided on our categories. Remember, I said don't make it more than maybe 20, 25 max. 15, 20 is often enough. These are these categories we're talking about. And you've now plugged in your numbers, and you can see we need to restructure. So in there, and I'm going to send the spreadsheet to you just to illustrate. So now we've sat down between myself, the spouse, and we've prayerfully gone through it, and we've now said, okay, what can we do? So first thing we decide, and I really would encourage this, I really find as believers, we have to work towards paying our tithe full 10%. In this example, remember they're earning 16,000 times 2. So tithes is 3,200. So we've actually upped a number here. There's nothing we can do about our rent. We're stuck. It's an obligation. So there's no restructuring I can do there. There's nothing I can do about my car. I'm locked in there at the moment. If, however, that green line was in the need section, that assumption may need to be relooked at. So, for example, I've got a friend who used to live up the street from me, and his work situation changed, and he no longer earned what he used to earn. So he had to sell his house, go and live in a cheaper area, and sell the second car. So he had to restructure this item here because he was so far, down that his salary line was in the blue in the stack bar graph. And so in his case, it required major restructuring. That's when you start talking debt consolidation. You change your whole fundamental, you can almost say. But in this case, we didn't need to do anything so radical because we managed to get margin without doing that. The one thing we did do is, and believe it or not, in town, we need to do this often. Go and take all the stuff that you haven't used for a while, and you go and encash it at Cash Crusaders or some secondhand things. So these guys went and did that, and they managed to pay off the store. So they no longer had that 1,000 Rand a month they needed to spend. There wasn't much we could do on our rates and taxes. We felt we could save a little bit on water and lights, just not leaving lights on all the time. Eskom's got wonderful examples. Don't boil a full 1.5 liter kettle. Boil 500 mils if all you're going to have is a cup, etc. Find ways to save on water and lights. We felt we could shave off 20% of our cost there. Nothing we can do on life. Food, we said, okay, we won't buy Woolies so much. Maybe we will go and buy from somewhere else. And we could save a little bit on clothes. Maybe we don't need brands, expensive brands. Maybe I must just wear my clothes a little bit longer, etc. So find ways to save there. Transport, a lot of guys in towns now using lift clubs. You can save a hell of a lot of money, something like that, etc. So we ran through our budget. We saw where we could make some savings, where we couldn't. And you rework this thing over and over until you get to a point, like I showed you in the slide, where you can see then our obligation, needs and wants. We now have got margin at the end of each month. So that's the process of tracking our actuals, we have our stack bar graph here. We then reorganize our plan until we get to a point where we now can see that in planning mode, at least, we have margin. And now it's a case of, now that we've got our plan, we now monitor month to month. How are we going? Are we managing to stick to the plan? And as you slowly start seeing, yes, I've got money left over each month, remember then what you start doing is you go to your small expensive debts, you use that margin, and you slowly start working away at this pink block, your debt obligations. Pay off your store credit, get your credit card balance down. I know most credit cards give you 30, 45 days, but if you go over that, the interest rate's usually quite heavy on your credit card, etc. So find your expensive debt then and start paying it down. So I just want to pause here. I think what's quite important is I was simply just trying to use an Excel example to illustrate that budgeting process of getting your categories, column C, tracking your actuals for a couple of months, column D, sitting with your spouse, coming up with a plan to make sure you've got margin, column E, and then you get to the intentionality. Now just do it. You've just got to start managing your finances to come in line with a plan. Are there any questions or clarity on this before we step on? I'm hoping what comes across, the concept isn't difficult, the discipline and the price we need to pay may be a bit more difficult, but yeah, I'm hoping it comes across. What we need to do isn't the problem here. It's whether or not we have the will to do it. Are there any questions we need to just talk about before we move on? Everybody happy? Can I continue? All right. So that was just a little Excel example. So now let's talk about when we are doing that planning to build this margin. Obviously, there are two ways in which I can open up a gap here. The one is to lift the green line up, in other words, increase our income. The other way is to bring these bars down, which is obviously what we did here in the example I showed you in Excel, meaning reduce our expenses. So I'm going to just go through each of those options fairly briefly, just to stimulate some thoughts. Remember, there's no ways in a few minutes like now, we can go through all the different creative ways of doing that. So let's just talk a bit about if we've got to reduce our expenses. So remember, we're bringing our stack bar graph down now. So the first thing is you've got to have a budget. It's so hard to try and do that if you don't have a budget. So we've been speaking about it. I just want to speak about this thing about I can't afford it. I think that one of our problems here that I often find is that people are too ashamed to say, listen, I've got a budget for this. Or let's say it's having coffee with friends and entertainment, and my budget is gone this month. Now somebody from church phones you, say, oh, can we meet for coffee? You know, whatever the case may be. And I think, you know, either switch to inviting them to a home rather than going to a coffee shop, but don't be shy to say, you know what, my budget for that, for this month, it's finished. Can we do it next month? And we really need to just get comfortable to say, you know what, I actually can't afford it. I've got a financial plan. I'm working towards getting debt free. Do you mind? I just can't afford it. And that's it. People will respect you. There's no shame in it. So now we need to talk about what are the different ways in which we can lower our standard of living. One of the, certainly up here in Joburg, the car running costs is a fairly significant item. Now, very often you'll find one of the people in the family is driving around in the family car. It's a hell of an expensive car that really is only needed in December. You know, when you go on holiday, say. And I once did a sum to say, if I rather had a much cheaper car, because 90% of the time I drive my car alone to work and back. What happens if I just drove a safe small car? And then when December comes, I will rent a family car. It's going to cost me 700-800 Rand a day. You'll be shocked to know that I could go on a 3-week holiday with an 800 Rand a day car, and it would save me a small fortune by just, my everyday car needs to be a cheapie. A small car, 18 Ks to the liter, but it's safe. etc. So we must be willing to just think a bit creatively. We need to think about our entertainment costs, branded clothing, our holidays, etc. All those things that was coming up in the suggestions. The other way is in terms of debt. We're going to focus on this next week. You know, very often your most expensive debt is not always your biggest debt quantum. It's usually store cards. It's any unsecured debt will be the most expensive. Remember, unsecured debt just means there's no asset behind it. They don't bond your land or your home or anything like that. And that's why they make it so expensive, because there's more risk for them. So that debt is usually the most expensive. If you really need to do big restructuring, there are companies who will do debt consolidation for you. So what happens is you put all your debt together. There's one interest rate you effectively are paying, but you obviously get a proper skilled person to help you work through that. Sometimes people buy their cars through their home loan. It usually was a little bit cheaper. I'm not sure nowadays it still is, but it used to be in the old days you could get a home loan at prime minus, but your car used to be prime plus. The important thing is if you're going to do that kind of thing, then make sure you still pay your car off in 4 or 5 years, whatever the case may be. Don't take 20 years to pay off your car. But there are many ways in which you can try and use your debt to bring down the cost of debt. Obviously, you can also say, all right, not only the cost, but reduce the quantum. That was the example I used with this friend of mine. He had to sell his house, go to a cheaper area, got rid of one of his cars, just a one family car, etc. So those are some of the ways in terms of debt. Remember the closing of the circle. Just repeating that concept again. What's really important if you are married is there should be transparency around where our money is going. It shouldn't be that only one person has full visual sight of what's going on in the finances. It's much better if you both have agreed on the plan and you are happy to keep the books open around where the money is going. Yeah, and don't underestimate how the small savings add up. You know, it's a couple $100 here, a couple $100 there, and before you blink, you've got 1,000 Rand a month saved up for your margin. And then, yeah, as you can imagine, God is not only interested in the so-called spiritual things, He's interested in our whole lives. And very often when you pray about things, God will show you some opportunities in your budget and in your finances and how to be wise about it. So certainly, I know there's some cultures where they don't want you to be praying about finances. I think we should, in a practical way, just pray about it. On the income side, this is now obviously more for a salaried scenario, person living in town, for example. Increasing income, very often we've got stuff lying around that we haven't used for a long time. If you're not using it, get rid of it, encash it, use that money to get rid of some short-term debt because you immediately start saving interest. We don't have the luxury of keeping stuff that we don't use. And then there's always the question around, well, what about us earning more? You know, where maybe we could, if one spouse was working half day, is there an option to work full day? Sometimes companies have got a need for overtime. Sometimes you can open a sideline business on weekends, etc. Many ways you can look at that. Obviously, there's a quality of life implication if you are going to do this one, where basically you're working more. And if you're going to do that, I think you need to be very sure your standard of living is first in line before you start affecting your quality of life so fundamentally, because this one definitely comes with quality of life implications. So those are just some broad thoughts on increasing the income. What I now want to get on to is talking a little bit about debt. So remember, while we are now planning from our actuals to our plan, especially now for if I can use the students as an example, before you now get locked into car deals in particular, just think about your whole debt structure quite carefully. So what I want to show here is a typical example that happens in a salaried scenario. So I'm still sticking with that family who was earning about 32 a month, combined 2 salaries. So let's call your salary 100%. Let's imagine now I am tithing 10% on my gross. So that means take off 10. Remember the tax rate for 2 people earning 16 a month would be about 10%. So that's another 10. We should, at an absolute minimum, be putting away 15% towards our retirement. So in this example, I'm assuming the company matches our contribution. Remember the example in the spreadsheet. And I'm assuming our medical aid was 6,000 Rand a month, which is 18%. Now, this is where the debt thing comes in. Very often, the banks would give you up to 30% of your this. Maybe post-COVID, they're a little bit more conservative. But I mean, the bottom line is if you really wanted to, you could usually get a home loan that was up to 30% of your gross income. So I've said, well, let's be a bit conservative. Let's imagine we only went for a home loan that was 25% of our gross income. If we took out a new car at 4,500 Rand a month, now you guys will know, go and look at the car adverts. That's not a hell of a fancy car. It's a nice car. And let's imagine this family said, well, let's have one nice car, and maybe the other one's the old Skedonk they got from somewhere. But the bottom line is that's another 14%. So now if you take your 100 and you take that off, I'm left with 15% or 4,700. Now, there's no ways a family is going to be able to pay for all the other needs and wants on 15% of your gross salary. So the bottom line is just because a bank or a car, the Westbank or whoever, just because they would give you the option to take that much debt doesn't mean you can afford it. Obviously, they have got security, especially on your home loan. So they're more willing to, in my opinion, go further than they should, further than that's healthy for us. And so if you just do a high level sum like this, you can very quickly get a sense of how much debt can I actually afford. And if you're going to be taking close to 35, 40% in total between a home loan and a car, I would suggest there's problems coming. And I hope I don't stand on anybody's toes here, but that's usually then when you will hear comments like, I actually can't afford to tithe. Sorry to be a bit blunt, but that's the reality we get. So I think be very careful when you're thinking about your debt. This ratio, obviously, for a farm would be quite different. I'm talking about a salaried scenario here, but the principle is the same. I think you've got to work out, how much debt makes sense. And even if you just do a high level sum like this, usually you can get to quite a good indication of how much debt can I actually afford. So please, when you're doing that plan, point we're making here, think carefully about how much debt can I afford. Do I need to go and restructure my debts a bit? Now, obviously, before you get your first salary, before you get locked in for your car repayment, then this is the perfect time to apply these principles. Once you're locked in, it's a bit more difficult because there's obviously consequences to doing that. So please think about when you're doing your plan, how much debt can I afford? Right, now taking a step back a bit. So I've thought about how much debt I can afford. We've done our plan. The question now is, how do we move towards financial freedom? Because remember, your plan now has to change with time. So I just want to show you 2 perspectives. And remember, every situation is different. But from some of the numbers I'm used to seeing, on the left, we've got our obligation, needs, and wants. So the most typical scenario I see is that nearly half of people's expenses are on obligations. And the other half is basically their needs. They need it to live. So then you ask, but what about the luxuries? And usually you will see they need a bonus, their 13th check or bonus. They need that to be able to have the luxuries. They're relying on that. In the short term, what we should be looking to do is we need to restructure our needs, like we spoke about in that Excel example, so that we can swing more money towards killing debt. Basically, in this example, we're saying your strategy could be, okay, in the short term, I'm going to swing 10% to kill more debt, and 10% is going to lie in my margin. That 10% margin then allows you to start earning a little bit of interest even on it. So your income line is going to go up a little bit. So in the short term, that could be how you restructure your plan, where you've just swung 10% from your needs into paying debt off, and a 10% out of your needs into savings margin. Now, if you think about your needs and you say, is there a way in which I can take off 20%? If you can find a way, you can see how this strategy then kicks into gear quite nicely. You might say, I've already cut all my expenses to the bone. Then you may need to look at more fundamental restructuring of your budget in terms of your plan. Ideally, what we should be working towards, because remember now, if we're putting away extra money towards killing debt, at some stage you become debt-free, in which case then your obligations, and I like this because it's almost like a third thinking, where you can say, okay, I eventually should be hoping as a salaried person where roughly a third of my money is towards paying my obligations, which includes your rent or your house, let's say, a third towards my needs, and then I've got basically a third to invest and to give. So in this example, I'm including your tithes, obviously, in that giving over here. So, that's the long-term plan. If you move towards this kind of long-term plan, you can see how you will very soon, when you are investing a good chunk of money, 25%, let's say, that passive income starts growing fairly quickly, that you're going to have to then grow that. Remember that green line that went up towards your financial freedom? When you're investing as much as 25%, that green line starts compounding quite quickly. Another view on that comes from Arno and Marianne. They have some material called Kingdom Budget. Their view is the following, and you can see there's some similarities. They're saying long-term, you should be looking at 10% tithes, 10% giving, 10% savings for your emergency fund. And by the way, for you students, early on in your life, get into the habit that you build up 6 months, initially 3 months, eventually 6 months of living expenses in the emergency fund, because fridges break, washing machines break, things happen where you need access to money, and that's when you don't want to go and get expensive debt to pay it off. You'd rather save that money in advance and you can buy the thing cash. So, 10% savings or stroke emergency fund. Remember, we're working towards, in this example, 20%. In this example up here, it was probably closer to 25, same kind of number. The point is, it's a material chunk of money. And then they're basically saying, if you can do that, structure your life that you can live off half of your money. So that's also a nice, easy way. Live off half, 10, 10, 10, tithe, sowing, savings, 20% investing. That's my 100% of my money. So that's also a nice, easy way of thinking about that financial plan. Remember, this is no more the long-term plan. Eh? You're working towards this. So the bottom line is there are many different materials you can read. They are very helpful. The point is, find one that works for you, and make sure that you don't only do your short-term budget, but you have a plan to say, how am I going to get to that debt-free place? And so you can hear, with time, you've got to keep your budget current. Okay. Before we step on to some thoughts for next week, that's basically the material I wanted to go through. Any questions? We have a minute or two. Dave, if you see any hands, just shout, please.
Yeah, I think if you've got a question, just unmute yourself and go for it.
All right. If there aren't any, Just with an eye on next week. So next week, we're going to be talking a bit more about debt. So what would be very useful, just to start getting your thoughts going on it, is make a list of each debt that you've got. How much is the monthly or annual payment? What is your current owing balance? What is the interest rate? If you need to phone an institution to find out, please do so, because it's quite important to know how much are you being charged. What is your remaining term? And start thinking about, are there any options to paying it off quicker? Remember, in some cases, they don't allow you to pay it off. You're locked in. In other cases, you can, but there's a penalty. So you would need to know how much is that penalty. And in other cases, you're allowed to. They're much better about this nowadays. I think people understand we shouldn't be stuck in debt forever. I think also give some thought towards, especially now for the farms and Dave, or any business for that matter. Dave included this in the survey. When you're thinking about your debt, remember the example I showed was debt as a percentage of your gross salary for a salaried person, kind of the perspective we would normally use. But for a business or a farm, you know, what's the most appropriate way to be thinking about your debt, and how much can you afford? Do you think about it as a percentage of your income? Okay, that's nice and simple, but your income varies one year to the next based on commodity prices. So maybe that's got its downside in that context, as a percentage of your total expenses or as a percentage of your asset value. So I think try and find a way that you can establish some norms to try and understand, am I more in debt than what I should be? What are other people doing? You know, see what you can learn, best practice, learn from the experience and pitfalls that others have fallen into. But at least we're trying to get to a point where you're having the thought, you know, is my debt affordable? Have I got too much? I wouldn't imagine you've got too little, not in the current interest rate environment. So yeah, some thoughts just to get your mind going on the whole concept of debt. All right, so just to recap, remember what we've said so far. We've said that money's influence is to try and own us. And unless we are its master, chances are you are its slave. And that's not God's plan. God's plan is freedom and legacy. And we've outlined those 4 steps, that graph. I hope that graph is stuck in our minds now. It's a nice and simple way to picture it. And the first part of that is to say we need to get to a point where every month I've got a little bit of margin left on a regular basis. And that process that helps us get there is personal budgeting. And yes, it's going to take some time and some discipline. But if you just think about being financially free right now, remember right up front, we asked the question, if you won 30 million, what would you do? In other words, there was no financial obligations you had to worry about anymore because the 30 million would cover it. What would you be doing? And that's financial freedom. That's the prize, that we have a greater degree of freedom in our lives. And money isn't narrowing our options down to such a great extent. That's the prize. We need to decide if it's worth the time and the discipline. Dave, that's it. Flat my story is 8.